You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London, with me, Juliet Spare. 2014 has been declared Africa's Year of Agriculture and Food Security. But where do the women come into this? It's estimated that if women farmers had the same access as men, agricultural output in 34 developing countries worldwide would rise by around 4%. This translates as up to 150 million fewer hungry people. But how deep-rooted is the gender gap in African agriculture? I'm joined in the studio by 4 guests who are going to, in turn now, introduce themselves.
My name's Lewis Temple. I'm the Chief Executive of IDE UK, International Development Enterprises, and we've spent the last 30 years working to help smallholder farmers across the developing world increase their incomes through accessing new markets for their produce.
My name's Hannah Stoddart. I'm Head of Policy for Food and Climate Change at Oxfam.
My name is Keith Boyfield and I'm a Fellow of the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I recently authored a paper called Commercial Agriculture, Cure or Curse, and I'm also the Africa editor of the Journal of World Economics.
My name's Elizabeth Hull. I'm a lecturer in anthropology at the School of Oriental and African Studies and a member of the Leverhulme Centre for Integrated Research on Agriculture and Health.
With climate change high on the agenda and food security being, and 2014 being declared as Africa's Year of Agriculture and Food Security, how important is it that society, policymakers, governments realise the role that women can have in winning a battle against food security? I think I'd like to start with you, please, Hannah, from Oxfam.
Well, it's absolutely vital that women are recognised as the crucial agricultural economic agents that they are in rural areas in developing countries. At the moment, women comprise a large proportion of the agricultural labour force in developing countries. They also, however, only rarely own land or have actual legal rights over the land that they are farming. So we see across most continents, less than 20% of agricultural landowners are actually women. We're also seeing a situation where a lot of the programmes that are designed to reach rural areas and reach rural farmers, such as extension services to train up and provide advice on different types of techniques. They're not designed in a way that women can necessarily always access or properly understand. A lot of the time, extension workers will arrive when women might be doing other work, and that's in the home. That's also an important thing to recognise, that women are also doing a lot of domestic work alongside working in the fields. And so all of this comes together to compromise the ability of women farmers to be as productive as they could be. And when we're seeing a situation where climate change stands to have devastating impacts potentially on agricultural productivity, harnessing the potential of women becomes all the more important.
Lewis Temple, can you tell us why potentially this gender gap has existed for so long and why it's taken now to really galvanise efforts?
Well, I don't necessarily think that the efforts are galvanised at the moment, actually. There's a lot more that needs to be done, but the results are impressive. The United Nations has calculated that $1 invested in a woman farmer achieves the equivalent of $11 invested in a male farmer in terms of the benefits for nutrition and health for the children in that family. So you can see, if you want to get your bang for the buck, it makes good economic sense to invest in women farmers. But the experience is that in the aid business, the aid industry, the investment in women farmers has been sadly lacking, and only something in the region of 10% of agricultural investment through aid is directed towards women farmers. So something's gone wrong there. And we're part of a global coalition called Farming First, which is strongly pushing for increased investment into women farmers.
Can someone tell me why women have been left behind then? Why has it always gone to men?
I would suggest that I agree
Elizabeth
with
Hull.
with all that's been said, I also think that the way in which gender serves as a system through which resources are allocated differently varies from context to context, and there's many different reasons for why that's the case. So it's very difficult to speak on behalf of every context as to why that situation has come about. In other places, perhaps generation or class will be more significant than gender. So we have to be careful not to speak too broadly in terms of the reasons why gender is used as a mechanism through which resources are allocated.
But there are some rays of hope. For example, the International Finance Corporation that works with the World Bank has been recording ways in which they've been investing in what used to be called appropriate technology, intermediate technology. And for example, with palm oil, Nigeria used to be the biggest exporter of palm oil worldwide in 1960, and then they discovered the other oil, petroleum, and it's now importing $435 million worth of palm oil a year. But what they are doing in Nigeria, and something like 80 to 90% of the palm oil production is actually produced by smallholders, and that means women, they've been able to introduce in some areas mechanized forms of digesters. And this, to quote the IFC report, has increased annual income for the farmers from $219 a year to $328 a year. Not a lot in terms of British standards, but in Nigerian standards in rural areas, it's a huge improvement. And you've got to bear in mind that the official unemployment rate in Nigeria is 24%. It's a lot higher for those between 15 and 24. Bob Geldof likes to refer to Africa as the teenage continent, and that's very true. All the pressures of demographics in Africa, the worrying thing about it is that, and combined with the move to towns, subsistence farming isn't going to be the answer in terms of, feeding that population.
There's the pressure on a teenage continent, so it's teenage women that need to be taught the skills or empowered to realise their potential to work on farms. Now, when I said, broadly, why have women been left behind? I think actually and you said it's important we don't sort of put into a too broad a perspective what is actually very individualised in certain areas. But I think when we're looking at this from a wider perspective with everyone in a room here, I think people need to see it in broad terms to realise that actually, a continent of teenagers, a lot's going to fall on young women's shoulders. And if they don't have the resources in order to know what to do, then there's going to be a gap.
And there is fundamentally a pattern. I mean, of course, it will play out differently in different contexts and different countries. But the very fact that across continents of all agricultural land holdings, normally less than 20% of those are owned by women. That is a pattern in which the power dynamic is largely in favour of men. I think looking at that power dynamic, it's also important to look at the kinds of initiatives that can be taken to encourage women to assert their own role, to take leadership, to be more vocally outspoken and active in their communities. For example, Oxfam runs a programme called Raising Her Voice in a number of countries, and essentially it seeks to work with communities of women to encourage them to form, collective groups where they can speak about their problems more actively, to seek representation in perhaps local decision-making bodies, to argue their corner in the political context as well. And as a result of some of those programmes that we've been running, you've started to see a stronger empowerment of women being willing to actually stand up for their rights more. And I think that's a core component. It's not just about sort of handing out land rights to women, it's also about running programmes and working with women in these countries to encourage them to demand their own rights.
I think you've also got to see all this in the context of family size. I was just noticing when I was reading up for this panel discussion this morning that in Nigeria, women on average have 5 to 6 children in rural areas. That's a heck of a lot higher than the sort of average, even in sub-Saharan Africa. So as well as, having to do a lot of work on the farm, they've got a whole host of responsibilities to do with children.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Well, that's what you said earlier, that these programmes are in place, but they arrive at the wrong time, when there's not the sort of understanding that, like you say there, Keith, that women have the other responsibilities, like bringing up 5 children.
Makes you wonder what the men are doing, doesn't it?
You said it.
Yeah.
So there's some quite practical things you can do to help women take advantage of new opportunities, but at the same time recognising that there are other responsibilities. At IDE, we work a lot to introduce smallholder subsistence farmers into horticultural production, growing fruit and vegetables for the local market. And often that's a kind of production system that is particularly suited to balancing the responsibilities of women with their families, with also producing produce for the market and selling that, increasing their incomes. In our program in Ethiopia, we've seen an increase in income up to $300 as a result of moving to horticultural productions of fruit and vegetables. And with the growing urban population in many African countries, there's increased demand for that kind of produce as people's appetites have become greater for fruit and vegetables. There is that market opportunity for them, for those farmers, and the women farmers are often the best place to be able to take advantage of that market opportunity. So there's some quite exciting opportunities there.
Well, go on, Hannah.
I was just going to say that I think there are some critical components in terms of upping the income of female farmers. Diversification is one. Diversification of crops, also access to inputs, so things like fertilisers, so that their yields can hopefully go up. But it's also actually interesting that some recent research by the World Bank and the One campaign actually has showed that even though these kinds of interventions are really important, so fertiliser, diversification, general rural infrastructure, you're also seeing that they don't necessarily always have the impact that you might expect on female productivity, because crucially these two core issues are not underlying issues, are not being addressed. And the first one is that women are still spending a huge amount of their time doing other labour other than working on the field, so also sort of domestic labour, running a household, which is extremely time consuming. And secondly, because the way in which training programmes, these extension programmes as they're called, are run is simply not accessing women. Often women aren't there. They're often designed in ways that make women feel uncomfortable. The way in which they're communicated is less familiar for women. So I just think it's important that we see the broader spectrum here of interventions that need to be made to really empower women, rather than always just thinking, build a road, hand the women some fertiliser, and hey presto. It's a bit more complicated than that.
But there's a tremendous opportunity here. I mean, it's just striking to see that Nigeria is importing $15 billion worth of staple foods every year. It used to be the breadbasket of sub-Saharan Africa. And they're the second largest importer of rice in the world. It's made Mr. Dangote even wealthier. He's the world's wealthiest black guy. They're importing fish, wheat, palm oil, as I say, which they used to be the biggest exporter of. And it's totally unsustainable. And at least they've got a reform-minded minister now who's trying to introduce a reform programme. The same thing is happening in Ghana. The Prime Minister gave a speech back in January saying that they've really got to focus on producing more of their own food, because they've got $1 billion food import bill. The only way in which Nigeria is able to sustain this food import bill is through petroleum oil, and that accounts for 95% of Nigeria's export revenues. It's ridiculous. They should be exporting food.
Elizabeth.
I think that the relevance in terms of the discussion about women, in terms of the shift to mass production of crops, is the difference between women as farmers and women as farm workers, as in the latter being women employed on farms and earning a wage. And there we see that women, in a lot of contexts, experience disproportionately casualisation. They lack the types of social security mechanisms that men have. A lot of times they lack maternity cover and other health and safety concerns in the workplace that relate specifically to women. And they occupy disproportionately temporary and casual jobs. So there's a real need to address through policy women's the role of women within waged agricultural labour, and not just in terms of women in family farms.
That's what you were saying, wasn't it, Hannah? Is not just sort of saying, here's the fertiliser, off you go. It's that transference of women seen as other labour, not just domestic labour.
And also the point around sort of empowerment and demanding rights, whether you are a female family farmer or smallholder farmer, and you're demanding more in terms of what you get from extension services. You're demanding more in terms of, recognition that you're doing like 5 jobs. There's that piece, but there's also the piece where if you're a woman working as a wage labourer on a farm and you're getting paid less than your male counterpart, for one, and being paid rock bottom wages, yes, you might not own that plot of land, but nonetheless you are a wage labourer on it. So again, it comes to, empowering women to demand rights, to unionise themselves, to act in, collectively with other workers and other female workers to demand more. So that empowerment piece is absolutely crucial across the board, whether as a female family farmer or as a wage labourer.
Striking an optimistic note, I'm an optimist by nature, you see. What you're actually seeing at the moment is a wave of investment, particularly in things like palm oil, which is a controversial crop. But at the moment, particularly Indonesian and Malaysian companies have pledged over $6 billion worth of investment into just West Africa. So you see Sime Darby investing in Liberia, and Olam investing in Côte d'Ivoire and Gabon. And when these major publicly quoted conglomerates start to invest in equatorial Africa, they bring to the party investment in such things as schools, health centres, things that are actually going to help family and particularly women. So that's a very positive thing, that when you see that investment, they're actually investing in a whole social infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure.
But that investment needs to complement a woman's role within the family, not sort of just exist.
Yes, but
so that she can
to the companies who are doing this, they're very, very aware of that.
Are they aware of the empowerment?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And they have whole sort of corporate social responsibility programs. I'm sure that we're probably going to have a bit of a disagreement, my friend Hannah from Oxfam and myself on this, but I think that this is a tremendous opportunity. Some of the NGOs take a slightly more sceptical attitude.
I'm
being diplomatic.
No, thanks, Keith. I think it's true that firstly, there is enormous potential for investment more broadly in agriculture, especially in the African continent. You've seen decades of underinvestment, and you've seen countries that have vast swathes of fertile land become net food importers, as you're referring to with Nigeria, and that is obviously not a good situation, and we need to reverse that. So, Oxfam sees the potential there. What we would say is that comes with some caveats. Investing in agriculture in terms of providing the infrastructure necessary, providing the support, certainly in the initial stages, to small-scale farmers whose productivity has huge potential to be increased. And when you invest in small-scale farming, you see very, very positive pro-poor poverty alleviation benefits. So first we'd say, go for smallholders first, go for infrastructure in rural areas first as well. When it comes to facilitating huge investments, private, large-scale investment, it can play a role, but you've got to do it very, very carefully. In many areas, in many countries in Africa, that I've spent time in, Zambia, being a prime example, through to Liberia, which is also attracting a lot of investment. You've got very complicated systems of land ownership and land tenure, right? You have a system of customary tenure, so that's kind of traditional arrangements of land ownership and stewardship. And it's often the lines are quite blurry as to who owns land. A lot of the time, women don't have any ownership over land whatsoever. And so it's not as simple as an investor coming in and saying, we're going to take over this large area of land, cultivate it, increase productivity. Because in the process of doing that, there are all kinds of potential pitfalls, essentially, in terms of who actually has claim over that land.
And Oxfam have discovered in Liberia.
Absolutely, and so Oxfam has seen, a number of communities sort of wake up and find their land that they've been farming and investing in, crucially, for decades, suddenly taken over by a large company in a deal that they've not heard about, they've had no stake in, that has basically been brokered over their heads. So that's not to say that large-scale investment isn't important and can play a role, but it is to say it has to be done properly. And ultimately, the yardstick of its success is the extent to which smallholders, and especially women, really benefit from it.
This all boils down to something called free, prior and informed consent amongst the indigenous people, which was adopted by the United Nations in 2007 in its Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But the whole issue of property rights in Africa is one of the most complex I've ever come across. And it's been made worse, you can argue, by such things as the 1978 Act in Nigeria that gave tremendous discretion to state governors. There are 36 states in Nigeria, and essentially the state governor has tremendous discretion over who he recognises to own a piece of property, and it's quite common for 3 sets of people to all show up at the state governor's office with all these contracts that have been stamped claiming to own the same piece of land. So there are tremendous opportunities for corruption here.
But the challenge is also how to ensure that the smallholder farmers and women in particular actually really do benefit from these investments.
Yeah.
And that's quite a practical challenge as well. I mean, IDE is working in northern Zambia, where there's been massive investment in the mining industry. Big copper mines opened up by international companies, and yet with huge employment opportunities as well for the local population to work there. And yet these companies are feeding many thousands of people with produce which is imported from outside of the area and outside of the country in many cases, in a part of the country which is surrounded by smallholder farmers, because they simply don't know how to grow the right kind of produce at the right time. So there's quite a practical challenge there of how to enable smallholder farmers to grow the right produce for the market. And given the huge decrease in the levels of agricultural extension services being provided by governments in most African countries over the last 20 years, there's not much in the way of knowledge transfer for those smallholder farmers from state service providers. So there is opportunities for the private sector to actually provide agricultural extension services as well, because smallholder farmers are businesses, and the businesses which serve them can be prosperous businesses as well. So,
Dr. Hull, you work with smallholder farmers in South Africa.
Yeah.
What experience do you have of their challenges or adoption to big investment farming?
Well, I mean, I would agree with the note of caution that's been raised in the discussion, and I think particularly if you look at the South African case, there is a difference between the rhetoric and the actual practice of what's happening on the ground. And of course the rhetoric is to support smallholder farmers and encourage them to increase their productivity and improve their livelihoods. And then on the other hand, what you have in reality is an agricultural landscape largely dominated by large-scale agribusiness in which people are, poorly paid, particularly women. You're finding increasing rates of casualisation. So we have to look quite carefully at this gap between rhetoric and reality in terms of discussions around as has just been mentioned, we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years a decrease in support for smallholder farmers in extension services and in fertiliser subsidisers and so on. There are specific cases like in Malawi where subsidising fertiliser has had very positive effects, but I wouldn't say that that's something that's happened across the board.
What really needs to come first? Combining the rhetoric with the reality, what would your message be? I'll finish by going around the table again, if that's okay. Lewis Temple.
Key message is smallholder farmers and women in particular are viable businesses, that to move from subsistence agriculture to growing for the market can have transformative impact on incomes and the lives and livelihoods of those farmers. So what we need to do is to ensure that all investments in those countries do enable people to participate in those economic opportunities. And there's some quite practical things to do in terms of ensuring that the technologies, the agricultural inputs, the seeds and the fertilizers are available through the market in the way that is suitable to the small farmer, and they can have dramatic impacts on their incomes through that. So the key thing is that those are available to small farmers, and that's obviously in very isolated rural areas. So we need to have some quite creative solutions to get those products, services, and knowledge into the hands of those farmers.
And into the hands of women. Hannah Stoddart from Oxfam, what would you like to see sort of happen first, or what's your lasting message?
I think the lasting message would be that markets and large-scale private sector investment alone are not going to be the vehicles to address the gender gap. They're part of the picture, but first things first, we need to address decades of underinvestment in agriculture from the public side as well. You need targeted public investment in rural infrastructure, in roads, in training programmes and extension services, as they're called, that specifically target women, are tailored towards women. You need greater sort of state-level acknowledgement that women in rural areas and women farmers are often doubling up as having a job in the domestic context as well, and being the heads of households. So you need to design policies that address that as well. And fundamentally, you need to address the structural inequalities that mean that, by and large, though women are spending huge amounts of time as agricultural workers or labourers, most of the time they don't own their own land. And addressing those structural inequalities from investing public sector money into these imperatives will only really start to happen if women are also empowered to demand change.
Keith Boyfield, then, a diplomatic response to...
One of the things I'm encouraged by when I go to countries like Gabon and Kenya is to see so many young, incredibly well-educated girls, women, emerging from the sort of lycées and colleges in those countries. And you've got to remember that the finance minister in Nigeria is a woman. So I'm encouraged by the fact that more and more educated women, not just in the cities, but across the countries, are emerging as leaders. And I'd like to see much more of that.
Finally then, Dr. Elizabeth Hull.
Well, I would say when it comes to gender and agriculture that there are profound structural inequalities, I agree, that need to be addressed. And frankly, I would say that this is very difficult to address from a top-down international development approach, and that if we want in some ways to do this or to assist this process, one very simple message would be to work with existing women's organisations in countries that have a very nuanced and close understanding of women's issues in those places, and to strengthen and assist those organisations to appropriate the resources that they need to try to tackle the problems of gender and class inequality within the context in which they live.
And on that note, I'd really like to thank all my guests for joining me on The Voice of Russia here in London. You're listening to Radio VR, The Voice of Russia in London, with me, Juliet Spare. 2014 has been declared Africa's Year of Agriculture and Food Security. But where do the women come into this? It's estimated that if women farmers had the same access as men, agricultural output in 34 developing countries worldwide would rise by around 4%. This translates as up to 150 million fewer hungry people. But how deep-rooted is the gender gap in African agriculture? I'm joined in the studio by 4 guests who are going to in turn now introduce themselves.
My name's Lewis Temple. I'm the Chief Executive of IDE UK, International Development Enterprises, and we've spent the last 30 years working to help smallholder farmers across the developing world increase their incomes through accessing new markets for their produce.
My name's Hannah Stoddart. I'm Head of Policy for Food and Climate Change. So all of this comes together to compromise the ability of women farmers to be as productive as they could be. And when we're seeing a situation where climate change stands to have devastating impacts potentially on agricultural productivity, harnessing the potential of women becomes all the more important.
Lewis Temple, can you tell us why potentially this gender gap has existed for so long and why it's taken now to really galvanise efforts?
Well, I don't necessarily think that the efforts are galvanised at the moment, actually. There's a lot more that needs to be done, but the results are impressive. The United Nations has calculated that $1 invested in a woman farmer achieves the equivalent of $11 invested in a male farmer in terms of the benefits for nutrition and health for the children in that family. So you can see, if you want to get your bang for the buck, it makes good economic sense to invest in women farmers. But the experience is that in the aid business, the aid industry, the investment in women farmers has been sadly lacking, and only something in the region of 10% of agricultural investment through aid is directed towards women farmers. So something's gone wrong there, and we're part of a global coalition called Farming First, which is strongly pushing for increased investment into women farmers.
Can someone tell me why women have been left behind then? Why has it always gone to men?
I would suggest that I agree with all that's been said. I also think that the way in which gender serves as a system through which resources are allocated differently varies from context to context, and there's many different reasons for why that's the case. So it's very difficult to speak on behalf of,
At the moment, women comprise a large proportion of the agricultural labour force in developing countries. They also, however, only rarely own land or have actual legal rights over the land that they are farming. So we see across most continents, less than 20% of agricultural landowners are actually women. We're also seeing a situation where a lot of the programmes that are designed to reach rural areas and reach rural farmers, such as extension services to train up and provide advice on different types of techniques. They're not designed in a way that women can necessarily always access or properly understand. A lot of the time, extension workers will arrive when women might be doing other work, and that's in the home. That's also an important thing to recognise, that women are also doing a lot of domestic work alongside working in the fields and at Oxfam.
My name is Keith Boyfield, and I'm a Fellow of the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I recently authored a paper called Commercial Agriculture, Cure or Curse, and I'm also the Africa editor of the Journal of World Economics.
My name's Elizabeth Hull. I'm a lecturer in anthropology at the School of Oriental and African Studies and a member of the Leverhulme Centre for Integrated Research on Agriculture and Health.
With climate change high on the agenda and food security and 2014 being declared as Africa's Year of Agriculture and Food Security, how important is it that society, policymakers, governments realise the role that women can have in winning a battle against food security? I think I'd like to start with you, please, Hannah from Oxfam.
Well, it's absolutely vital that women are recognised as the crucial agricultural economic agents that they are in rural areas in developing countries.